I'm Margaret O'Mara, and that was just Woody Guthrie that I was playing on Spotify, the mixture of the 20th century and the 21st all together. Hello, I'm so glad to be here. I'm so glad you all are here. Thanks for coming out on this very, very cold night here in Seattle. And I want to welcome everyone in the room, students, past and present, faculty, staff, community members, friends. I also want to give a special shout out to the Access students, who are both students and community members in the room, who are such an important part of our history community. And we're all so glad you're here and welcome you, and thank you for being such stalwart supporters of our department and our lecture series. I hear a little bit of feedback on my mic. Are other people hearing that too? A little bit? Maybe we need to turn things down. Maybe it's the hearing. All right, we'll get those. There's always, especially when you're talking about tech, there's always some high tech something. So let me begin with the acknowledgement of the nations and peoples whose lands are beneath and surrounding us. The University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. And Duwamish. This acknowledgement is particularly meaningful tonight, for after a series that has traversed continents and several millennia, my talk brings our exploration of river histories home, quite literally. The Columbia River empties into the same shared waters of the Coast Salish peoples to which this university's land acknowledgement pays tribute. It also encompasses the lands of other great tribes and bands of the Pacific Northwest, the Yakima, Warm Springs, Umatilla, and Nez Perce. The Columbia River was the artery followed by Lewis and Clark to its mouth at the Pacific. The song that played right before I took the stage, Woody Guthrie's Roll on Columbia, is Washington's official state folk song. The Columbia's history is this region's history. And each generation on this river has been shaped by those that came before it. As our beloved and greatly missed colleague, the late Linda Nash, wrote in her revelatory Journal of American History article about the Skagit River, individuals can never impose completely new understandings on a river. They must build upon the discourses and understandings that precede them. This article, I should note, had its origins in a seminar paper written while Linda was a graduate student in this department. Another UW historian who has chronicled the history of rivers and this particular river is our esteemed former colleague, Richard White, who considered the intertwined human and natural histories of the Columbia in his landmark 1995 book, The Organic Machine. In the book's opening pages, Richard defined the organic machine of the Columbia as, quote, an energy system which, although modified by human intervention, maintains its natural, its unmade qualities. The Organic Machine chronicled the human encounter with and harnessing of the Columbia's energy from the early 19th century through the end of the 20th. Richard traced successive and overlapping attempts to extract material value from the river to make it controllable, navigable, and profitable. The river history that Richard tells in The Organic Machine is one of abundance and finitude, of a river about which everything was big, its breadth and length, size and ferocity of rapids and falls, swiftness of currents, of enterprises whose bigness was comparable, the fur trade, the salmon fisheries, hydropower dams. Published in 1995 at the very beginning of the commercial internet age, The Organic Machine traced these successive generations, but came too soon to chronicle the latest chapter in the Columbia's history of bigness, cloud computing, and AI. I'd like to proffer this talk as the first draft of that latest chapter. Over the last 20 years, the Columbia Basin has become one of the nation's most important concentrations of very large single-occupancy data centers, also known as server farms, built and run by the world's largest technology companies. The photo here portrays Google's facility in the Dalles, a town of 10,000 people on the Oregon side of the Columbia River Gorge. Google's facility, which opened in 2006, is, like others run by Google's compatriot big tech companies, staggeringly big. It now consists of totals about 3 buildings that are about 350,000 square feet in total. And it just won local approval to build a 4th facility that will add another 290,000 square feet. This complex draws on the hydropower of the nearby Dalles Dam, as well as on the water of the Columbia itself to cool its servers. Facilities like this one are the physical and material manifestations of seemingly disembodied digital technologies like cloud computing and artificial intelligence. As the competition to build advanced AI accelerates, large technology companies are plowing billions of dollars into building such centers, which house powerful chips that AI operations demand. The global data center footprint and its rate of energy and water consumption is growing with every query we type into Claude or ChatGPT. So it is no surprise that so many big data centers now cluster near a river whose dams now produce 40% of the hydropower in the United States. The internet does not live in the cloud, it lives on the earth and congregating in certain places, and the Columbia Basin is one of them. Why the Columbia? The data centers are there for some of the same reasons that the river basin attracted earlier generations of explorers and capitalists. The basin has a cool and dry climate, not subject to terrible extremes of temperature. It has open and rolling terrain outside the earthquake zone of the coast. It's not too far from places like this one, high-tech centers of the Pacific West, but it's far enough that the land is cheap and it is easy to find enormous tracts on which to build. And then there's the might and power of the river itself, which provides the water to cool the center's thousands of servers and ample, cheap, and renewable electricity. Over 2 centuries, this river basin has proved to be a particularly hospitable place for large, globally connected enterprises operating at enormous scale. Fur, fish, hydropowered factories, cloud computing, and AI. 214 years ago, a Scots-Canadian scout named Alexander Ross arrived at Celilo Falls, which is part of the long narrows of the river that later was obliterated by the Dalles Dam. Today, the northern part of that riverbank is Washington State's Columbia Hills State Park. Only a few miles upstream from where Google's data center now sits, Ross found a vibrant native gathering place that had been the intersection of transcontinental trade routes for centuries. The lifeblood of the settlement was salmon. The turbulent waters of the Columbia at the Narrows proved to be astoundingly bountiful fishing grounds. Tribal estimates now place the annual salmon runs during that period between 10 and 16 million a year. By the 1990s, that number, including salmon from hatcheries, had dwindled to 1 million. Restorations and hatcheries on the upper Columbia have in recent years gotten it back to over 2 million a year, but still far, far below the goal of those who want to restore the salmon runs. Ross was amazed at all he saw at the Long Narrows, what he termed the great emporium or mart of the Columbia, and the general theater of gambling and roguery. The population of that native settlement swelled to as many as 10,000 people at times. But Ross was now not scouting the Columbia for the fish. Instead, he was in the employ of the then richest man in America, John Jacob Astor, who had made a fortune in the fur trade of the Old Northwest, what we now know as the Upper Midwest, and who now had his sights on the fur-bearing animals of the Columbia Basin, most of all, the beaver. Here is where river history meets fashion history, meets eventually high-tech history, and why I think when we think about AI, we need to think about beaver fur top hats, and I hope you keep that association in your minds from here on out. Beaver fur made for a fine, waterproof felt that was used to make men's hats for the better part of 3 centuries. Intense demand for the fur in Great Britain and Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries nearly eliminated the populations of Eastern European and Scandinavian beaver. So the opening up of the North American continent to the fur trade filled in the gap and then some. Beaver pelts became the first great American commodity, a driver of personal fortune and a shaper of geopolitical struggles among the great powers and private companies vying for control of the western parts of the North American subcontinent. The supply of beavers seemed infinite. The demand for hats was immense. Beavers were slaughtered at such a rate that the hungry market couldn't keep up. Fur trading was tough, bloody, hyper-competitive. It also was staggeringly profitable for those who succeeded at it. Most successful of them all was Astor, a German immigrant whose self-made fur trading empire turned him into America's first multimillionaire. Lewis and Clark's success in reaching the Pacific prompted Astor, who never personally visited the Pacific Northwest, to send 2 expeditions to the region in 1811, one by boat and one overland, under the banner not of the US government, but of Astor's newly established Pacific Fur Company. It is instructive to note here that Astor is dispatching these expeditions at almost exactly the same time, the moment that on the Texas border, the US and Spain are skirmishing over where that will be, exactly what Ray Jonas, my colleague, was describing in his lecture last week. We have 2 riverine frontiers, 2 concurrent struggles among nation states over territory, empire, and economic opportunity. Astor had an expansive global sense of markets that included not just the Atlantic, but the Pacific. And as chief reason he wanted to establish a fur trading outpost on the Pacific was to facilitate trade with China. That outpost was Astoria at the Columbia's mouth, which became the first permanent American settlement on the West Coast. But Astor's dreams of market domination were upended by geopolitics. The War of 1812 made the US government unwilling to provide Astor with military support of his Columbia expedition. The treaty that ended that war ceded Fort Astoria to Great Britain, and Astor soon sold out his stakes to the Hudson Bay Company. Some of these proceeds were used by Astor to buy up farms on the island of Manhattan, and these and other real estate investments became the source of his greatest fortune. By the time of his death, Astor had a net worth that was roughly equivalent to $170 billion in today's dollars. If you think that's a lot, well, I checked this afternoon, and Elon Musk's current net worth is estimated at more than $390 billion, so there we go. This map of Oregon country from 1838, here's the full thing, and here's an inset, a zoomed-in title, shows how utterly the British Hudson Bay Company and its fur trade consumed and defined the entire Pacific West during this period. Here we zoom in to the Columbia River Basin and the settlements within. Fort Astoria, now renamed Fort George, Fort Vancouver on the north shore of the Columbia, and what is now Vancouver, Washington. The Hudson's Bay Company not only extracted maximum value from the beaver and other fur-bearing animals, but as these populations began to dwindle, as they did after several decades of million pelt harvests, the Hudson Bay Company began to diversify and scale up the enterprise. This had much to do with the entrepreneurial energies of one HBC agent named George Simpson, who made several visits to the region to consolidate, diversify, and industrialize operations and move the company business into lumber and fisheries as well as fur. As Simpson observed on his first visit, quote, "The trade of this side of the mountain is, if sufficiently extended and properly managed, I make bold to say, can not only be made to rival, but to yield double the profit that any other part of North America does for the amount of capital employed therein," unquote. In his willingness to elbow competitors out of the way and swiftly extract maximum value from the resources at hand, Simpson, like Astor, had a good deal in common with some familiar modern-day tech entrepreneurs. The Oregon Treaty of 1846, which defined the US-Canada boundary at the 49th parallel, brought the era of the Hudson Bay Company to an end along much of the Columbia. But it did not end the fur trade, even though the industry by that time had winnowed beaver populations to near extinction. By century's end, states like Oregon began to place limits on how many beaver pelts could be harvested. The finitude of this once abundant resource was clear. By that time, another industry had taken center stage on the Columbia, the the fishing and canning of salmon. The many millions of salmon that ran through the Columbia's waters had provided sustenance to native tribes for centuries, and the technologies that indigenous peoples deployed to catch the salmon were ingenious and effective. The runs were so abundant at Solillo Falls that native fishers used spears to catch the salmon. Fishing platforms were another technology widely used on the river, such as the ones pictured here, used in the early 20th century further upriver at Kettle Falls, Washington, an area known by the tribal peoples as Roaring Water or Keep Sounding Water. This centuries-old fishing ground was completely submerged a few decades later, after the construction of the Grand Coulee Dam. By the early 20th century, indigenous methods of fishing were existing side by side with industrial-scale operations to catch, can, and export fish. Seine nets pulled by horses and motorboats were taking in greater and greater portion of the Columbia's catch, scooping up Chinook salmon by the millions to send to the region's canneries. The notes attached to this 1928 photograph from UW Library's Special Collections, from which many of these photographs come, gives an indication of the scale of this early 20th century canning industry. Empty salmon cans ready for filling, it reads. The various salmon canneries used 307,740,000 of these in putting up the 1927 pack. The first salmon hatcheries on the lower Columbia opened in the late 19th century, but they could only partly compensate for the millions lost. The salmon runs once were so great that one 19th century visitor quipped that he could walk across the Columbia on the backs of the fish. No longer. That brings us to the next act of the story of capitalism on the Columbia, that of the great dams. The land around the Columbia Gorge filled with small family farms in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Yet the further east you traveled in Oregon and Washington, the harder it became to sustain these small farms. Farms needed water, and farming families needed electricity, and accomplishing this in this arid, lightly settled region required large-scale infrastructure. The populist movements that emerged in the far west during this period made public financing of infrastructure and public utilities part of their rallying cry. The farm depression of the 1920s and the Great Depression of the 1930s made electrical service even more of an urgent need and escalated calls for economic diversification of the inland Pacific Northwest. Out of this populist agitation came formation of multiple public utility districts that continue to serve as the water and power utilities for counties in eastern Oregon and Washington. And out of this too came the Bonneville Power Administration, or BPA, the federal agency that built the great dams of the Columbia starting in the 1930s. Now let's take a beat to ponder this irony of this river's history. The cheap and abundant power that now has drawn the world's largest and wealthiest technology companies to the Columbia Basin is there originally because populist farmers and their New Deal allies wanted to make sure electrical power and water for irrigation were more fairly distributed to the little guy. The dams built on the Columbia by the BPA, a project that had also financed paid Woody Guthrie to travel around and write folk songs about the dam-making projects, including Roll on Columbia. These dams were of staggering scale. Here's a photograph of the Grand Coulee Dam under construction in 1937 being visited by President Franklin Roosevelt. The Grand Coulee was opened in 1941. It's one of the largest man-made structures on Earth. 550 feet high, just under a mile long, 22 million cubic yards of earth were excavated to make space for it, and 12 million cubic yards of concrete were poured to build it. 7,000 men worked on its construction at the peak of its construction, and 77 of those men lost their lives during doing so. The Grand Coulee was only one of many dams built to harness the power of the Great River in the middle of the 20th century. Each dam further diminished and weakened the salmon runs of the Columbia, but each opened up new opportunities for large-scale agricultural and industrial development in the region, not only in the inland Pacific Northwest, but in metropolitan areas like our own, where energy-intensive industries like aluminum and aerospace were powered by the hydroelectric might of the Columbia's great dams. This hydropower immediately made its usefulness known with the defense mobilization of World War II, in which the shipyards and munitions plants of the metropolitan Pacific Northwest played a major role. Even more consequential and long-lasting, a mark on the region was the top-secret facility built along the Columbia at Hanford, tasked with manufacturing the plutonium needed for the atomic bomb. Here again, the Columbia enabled production at massive scale. Construction of the facility, here's the construction camp, employed 50,000 workers alone. Hanford was a facility made possible by the abundance of the river, its cool water, its cheap hydropower, its mild and arid climate, its vast and remote landscape. The data centers of today rely on precisely the same thing. It was not only at Hanford that the Columbia and its dams became part of what my colleagues John Finley and Bruce Hevely have termed the Atomic West. The Columbia Basin became home to several aluminum smelting plants, such as this large facility in the Dalles that was opened in the 1950s by Harvey Aluminum, with major financing from the Department of Defense, which guaranteed that California-based aluminum producer that it would buy most of its output, because the metal was used for airplanes, making it a defense-critical industry. The damming of the Columbia enabled a great deal of aluminum production to emerge in eastern Washington and Oregon during this period, and federal defense spending drove much of its business. Harvey Aluminum was in the Dalles because the government's dam building program had by that town come to Celilo Falls, just a short distance down the river. The great narrows of the Columbia, the emporium for gambling and roguery that Alexander Ross had observed in 1811, was also home to centuries-old petroglyphs, which lined the canyon along the riverbed. Unable to stop the construction of the dam and the flooding of the places their ancestors had gathered, tribal members jackhammered about 40 of these artworks off the cliffs. They have since been reinstalled in a permanent outdoor exhibition in Columbia Hills State Park on the Washington side of the river, a place that I highly recommend you visit if you have not already. Celilo Falls, however, was no more. The great falls that had required the Lewis and Clark expedition to embark on a grueling portage, that had been a place of commerce and community and more for Native tribes for centuries, were now subsumed by one of the 10 largest hydropower dams in the United States. Now the Dalles and its communities around it had abundant and cheap power, far more than they could use. This spurred the federal government to authorize and fund construction by the early 1960s of a massive electrical intertie, which is the map here, the Pacific Northwest-Southwest intertie, which runs from a BPA power station outside the Dalles all the way to Southern California. The 3,100 megawatt transmission path provides approximately half of the electricity for the Los Angeles metropolitan region. Dam-powered industrialization came at a cost. Aluminum smelting is a dirty, dirty business, and the pollutants that it sent to the atmosphere proved deadly for the fruit orchards that were another key piece of the region's economy. The steep environmental costs of these particular types of industrialization along the Columbia River were very much on citizens' minds by the early 1970s as the modern environmental movement gained steam. And local economic development authorities, meanwhile, were continuing to push for more industrial facilities to locate along the Columbia. This push prompted a citizen-led movement to mitigate the damage along the gorge and resulted ultimately in the gorge being designated a national scenic area under the presidency of Ronald Reagan in 1986. And the designation as a national scenic area, as well as the larger pressure from citizens of the Pacific Northwest, the metropolitan Pacific Northwest, and environmental groups, increased the pressure for small towns and cities of inland Oregon and Washington to find industries that were cleaner, less polluting, and more likely to be welcomed by their neighbors. This brings us to our final, still unspooling chapter of this river history. When the Columbia became where the internet lives. The story of the Columbia River's supersized data centers begins with one now quite familiar piece of software. I'm curious, and I would like a show of hands, how many people have a Gmail account? Well, congratulations, your data lives somewhere along the Columbia River. Google debuted Gmail in 2004. The first, believe it or not, the first of a suite of web-based software offerings that were soon joined by Google Docs and Google Slides and other products that still make people in Redmond shudder. Gmail and other web-based email services provided by companies including Microsoft were early examples of what was back then called computing in the cloud and what is now simply called cloud computing. As its data processing and storage needs grew, Google, which would make a splash on Wall Street when it went public in 2005, went in search of a big tract of cheap land in the inland Columbia Basin. And by 2006, it had found the Dalles. Such dispersion was possible thanks to the previous decade's flurry of fiber optic network construction during the dot-com boom. A network that usually followed existing utility routes like the Pacific Northwest-Southwest intertie. Although wildly overbuilt, it was estimated that upwards of 90% of the nation's 90 million miles of this cable remained unused at the turn of the 21st century. Fiber optic networking allowed data centers to be planted in quite remote locations without sacrificing speed and quality of connection. So that makes the Columbia Basin and its hydropower dams and its electrical connectivity, which now has fiber optic cable laid along the same path, a place ripe for a ripe destination. Another lure, particularly on the Oregon side of the river, tax breaks. In 1989, to try and create incentives for industries to locate in inland cities and towns, Oregon did what many states and localities did during this period, which was to create an enterprise zone program, which offered 3 to 5 year tax exemptions from all local property taxes, as well as other business-friendly measures to draw employers into places they ordinarily wouldn't come. This measure was enacted into law in Oregon, just to place it in time, 4 years before the first commercially available internet browser, 5 years before the founding of Amazon, and 9 years before the founding of Google. Mark Zuckerberg was in kindergarten. So data centers and technology companies were not on the mind of Oregon lawmakers. Aluminum and other manufacturing industries were. Yet it turns out that data centers have been the biggest users and beneficiaries of Oregon's program. In Washington, data centers, including the very large facility that Microsoft opened in Quincy the same year that Google came to the Dalles, also benefit from special state and local tax breaks. But Oregon's program is so potentially lucrative to companies that even Amazon, based here in Seattle, has placed several centers in Oregon rather than here. The state of Oregon has reported that these property tax breaks totaled $2.5 billion from 2007 to 2020. That data is in part, we know this data in part because of the dogged reporting of journalists from the Oregonian, among other papers. Exemptions are growing along with the size of the data centers. Those awarded in the last 3 years are worth at least another $1 billion. Yet permanent jobs didn't grow along with them, as happens often with these types of tax break programs. The vast majority of the jobs involved in data centers are in their construction. Fortunately for certain job seekers, the construction is continuing apace. The data center boom has led to a boom in work for skilled electricians. As New York Times journalist Karen Weiss described in this fascinating report on Quincy that ran in the paper around Christmas time this past year. So I recommend you look it up. It is fascinating to see how the trades and old economy jobs are being boosted by this very new economy phenomenon. To give a sense of what this concentration looks like, here is a map of some major tech data centers in Washington and Oregon, all located east of the Cascades, all near the Columbia River and its tributaries, all tapping into the hydropower produced by the Columbia's dams. Note here that this map comes from the Oregonian and is close to a decade old. It is a decade old. I forget it's 2025. So there are data centers in existence that do not appear on this map. Amazon has additional facilities in Eastern Oregon by now, for example. And one salient thing to know about data infrastructure is that the companies that own and run these very large data centers generally do not release much information about them, including their precise locations. In fact, for the first 2 years of its existence, the Google data center facility in the Dalles did not appear in Google Maps. Of course, the people in the town knew that something was up. When Google first moved into the Dalles, it was on a holding company not known as Google, but they quickly clued in that was it about, and they started referring to the whole facility as, and the owner of the facility, Google, as he who shall not be named, like Harry Potter. And then the Google got in on the joke and put a sign on the chain link fence outside saying Voldemort Industries. So we can all laugh about it. So there are other demands that data centers place on the towns and the resources of the Columbia Basin. Humming computer services need a lot of cold water to keep them from overheating. And so data centers consume a tremendous amount. Google's level of water consumption in the Dalles was something the company did not want the public to know. The city went so far as to sue the Oregonian on Google's behalf to prevent the data from becoming public. When it dropped the suit and revealed the total, the numbers were jaw-dropping. 274.5 million gallons consumed in 2021, or about 29% of the municipal water supply. Some other numbers of note. Google has reports it has made a $1.8 billion capital expenditure on its facilities in the Dalles. That was data from about 18 months ago, so I think it's probably spent quite a bit more. The estimate is that the company has received about $260 million in tax breaks, and the data center employs permanently about 200 people. So data centers don't really require that many people to run them, and a lot of the work is security or custodial work. These are not places where engineers are sitting and coding. These are where all the information lives in secure spaces, but there are not as many high-skilled, high-tech jobs as there are in a place like Seattle or the Bay Area. The Columbia Basin is only one of the places around the country and the world that data centers are growing larger, larger, larger. Here is Meta's facility in Mesa, Arizona, which gives you a sense of the scale of these facilities these days. And I should note, I got this image from Mark Zuckerberg's Facebook page. I follow him, he does not follow me back. This is where I got this image too from Mark's Facebook stream. It's one he posted last month that shows the footprint of Meta's under construction data center in Northeast Louisiana, superimposed over the island of Manhattan to show its immense size. Wonder what John Jacob Astor is thinking about Manhattan now. Richland Parish, Louisiana, where this center will be located, is in another great river basin, that of the Mississippi Delta. Comparably rural, hungry for industry, and supplied by cheap electricity from federally built dams. Technology companies are spending more and more on data infrastructure than ever before. Mark Zuckerberg announced earlier this year that Meta would spend up to $65 billion on data centers in 2025. Other large platform companies are spending comparable, if not more, amounts. Why this frenetic buildup, you ask? Because of AI. The advent of generative AI has further pushed up the enormous digital data demands of cloud computing. The language used to describe AI evokes the language of superabundance and transformation that once was used to describe the United States' westward expansion, to describe the Hudson Bay Company's empire of fur, to describe the superabundance of Columbia salmon, to describe the atomic bomb. Massive, powerful, transformative, inevitable. And in earlier moments along the Columbia, this growth comes with resource extraction. Data infrastructure now accounts for 4% of US energy demand and is predicted to grow to 6% or even as much as 11% going forward. As our colleagues in UW Engineering have found, training a large language model like ChatGPT-3, which is now old generation, takes an amount of energy that is roughly equivalent to the yearly electricity consumption of over 1,000 US households. So when you're asking ChatGPT something that maybe you could just ask a friend or search on Google, do that. Admirably bold commitments to achieve near-term carbon neutrality have resulted in tech companies releasing numbers related to overall water and energy consumption, showing significant year-over-year increases as their data empires expand. And so they are actively in search of alternative energy sources, not only hydropower, but also solar, wind, and even capturing wasted natural gas. Helion Energy, based in Bellevue, is partnering with Microsoft, here's their facility in Everett, to build what promises to be the world's first nuclear fusion power plant, scheduled to open for business in 2028. The data centers of the Columbia Basin are one piece of what is now referred to as the global data sphere, a literal World Wide Web of server farms and transcontinental and oceanic cables, whose energy consumption is measured in zettabytes, that means 1 billion terabytes, and accounts for close to 2% of global energy demands, with a carbon footprint roughly the same as the combined annual emissions of Sweden and Finland. It consumes 2.6 trillion gallons of water a year, roughly the same amount needed to fill 1 million Olympic-sized swimming pools. It takes up 3,400 square kilometers of land, about the same size as New York City, and I think probably if I'm talking a year from now, that number will be a lot bigger. The US has more data centers than any other nation, about 25% of the global total. Back in 2006, right about the time that Google was opening its data center in the Dalles and Microsoft was opening its facility in Quincy, the late Senator Ted Stevens of Alaska was roundly mocked after referring to the internet as, quote, a series of tubes. Jon Stewart of The Daily Show quipped that the remark sounded more like something you'd hear from, let's say, a crazy old man at an airport at 3 a.m. than the chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee. To critics, Stevens' observations seem to confirm that an aging generation of national politicians didn't have a clue about how tech worked, much less how to regulate it. But on this, Stevens was absolutely right. The internet is indeed a series of tubes. More broadly, a global network of millions of miles of cables and wires and routers and servers and warehouses and physical things to make the internet work. The path that this infrastructure takes has a history of its own, following the routes of railroads and highways and electrical tie lines. Its nodes and substations mapped before the internet age, products of politics, reflections of social capital and market power. These data centers do what they do. We do what we do because of what the past made possible. The internet lives in places next to New Deal dams and Cold War aluminum plants, and thanks to populist public utilities and public university research and Clinton-era enterprise zone tax breaks. The connective threads of history do not show history repeating itself, but reveal continuities and patterns. The entrepreneurial Astor and his furs and real estate, the entrepreneurial Brin and Page and Bezos and Zuckerberg with their software code and booming stock market. The most important features of Columbia Hills State Park are the rocks on which appear the pictographs and petroglyphs of the native peoples who once gathered at Solillo Falls. Some of those were the ones relocated to higher ground after the dam flooded the falls. Others remain where they have always been. The most sacred of these is a petroglyph of a female chief, Shaglagal, or she who watches, in the Wasco Wishram language. Here she is, high up on her rock. I took this picture. She looked at me. Here she is facing the river. Oral tradition has passed down a story that goes like this. The legend of She Who Watches tells of a female chief who was concerned over what would happen to her people when she was gone. Coyote came to her and told her that soon the world would change, that men would come from far away, and that women would no longer be chiefs. Coyote then tricked her and turned her into a rock, saying, "Now you shall stay here forever, watching over your people and the river." She Who Watches now looks over a river widened by the dam, its aluminum mills gone. the Google data center a few miles downstream on the other side. She now watches over big data in its physical form, over the creation of artificial intelligence, whose creators promise or warn that this is new thing will be greater than all the other new things before it, and might even change the world even more than the men that Coyote warned would change her world of the Columbia. It is a tech world where far too few women are chiefs, where technology can be seen not as a product of history, when of course it is so very much part of history, of place, of humanity, of a river. Thank you so much. And I want to say that this talk was made possible by the UW History Department in many dimensions, by the work of my colleagues past and present. And here is if I had a fully complete list, it would be many slides and the font would be too small. Richard White, Linda Nash, John Finley, Bruce Hevley, Jim Gregory, Josh Reed, Glennis Young, Steve Beta, Joseph E. Taylor, Robert Self, Jess Cavallari, all historians whose work has informed what you just heard. I also give my gratitude to the editors and contributors to the Pacific Northwest Quarterly over all these many years, my fellow river historians, Joel Walker, Anand Young, Ray Jonas, for their brilliant talks over the last 3 weeks, to Nick Grawl for making this event possible, and all of the rest of the history staff and the students who made this possible, and I want to thank you. Thank you all for being here.
That was spectacular.
Thank you, Jim. Jim Gregory, everybody.
The Organic Machine AI edition, a new chapter in Richard White's, classic book.
Yes.
I think he'll love it.
Yes, I hope so.
Yes. Do we love it? So every time Margaret ever gives a talk or writes anything, I learn much more than I already expect to learn, and this is no exception. This was so interesting, and the way you weave history from beavers to AI data centers, all in the Columbia. So this is our Q&A session. We're going to spend about 10 minutes doing this, and so I was asking Margaret to just kind of reprise a little bit of this whole kind of tightly linked story that's very theoretical. Mm-hmm. It's a theoretical story about extractive industries, starting with furs, that are tied into global networks of consumption and investment, and it results in predatory uses of that particular riverscape and landscape. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I think that I'm still mic'd up. I think that there's sort of I think all of these industries start with this presumption of abundance or infinite supply. This is, of course, the story of westward expansion by European Americans across the North American continent, which is like, manifest destiny. There's so much land, so much there. And it's the story of so many extraction of natural resources that went to excess, whether it be timber, whether it be fur, whether it be fish. But coming from this presumption that, there's so much there, we're never going to run out. And the thing about beaver fur, of course, that once the populations did dwindle, and by the middle part of the 19th century, it's pretty clear that this is not an infinite resource. What happens? Top hats are still in style, but they start being made out of silk instead of beaver fur. That you don't need. I mean, beaver fur is a very warm, does provide. It was used for outerwear and for centuries, and does provide warmth. But when it comes to a top hat, which is sort of this excessive, dandyish, very common, but it uses a lot more material than you need to stay warm. And you actually don't have to make it out of fur. So once that was no longer, so I feel like there's this interesting, this oftentimes when it comes to digital technologies, we think about these, we can think about this when we think about social media, which initially was like, or the free internet, you don't have to pay for it, it's the World Wide Web, you just go on, and then you realize, I'm paying for this with my data, my information, and having to be served up ads. There is always some cost to it. So, and that's why I've become so interested in the actual, physical footprint of all of these technologies, that they exist in space. And it's become so, and my obsession with the data center predates the AI boom, but the AI boom has just taken it up to next level. It's really, really extraordinary. And what you're seeing here is so much capital being deployed into these centers because these companies have so much capital. They're expending an immense amount of money.
Do we have any questions from the audience?
The water is taken out of the river because it's dirty. It gets dirty, so it can be. Yes. So what happens with the water? And I'm going to be. And I'm sure there's someone who's an environmental engineer or a water engineer in the audience who's going to be like, actually, but it is something that it becomes, gray water, brown water thankfully you can't just put it right back into the river because it's the process of it flowing through to cool all the servers is something that makes the water, among other things, it heats it up to a very high temperature. So you can't just go back and it would be disturbing the ecosystem to send it right back in. So it's using municipal water supply. It's not just kind of bringing it straight out of the river, but there is. Oh, this is getting beyond my pay grade here. This is where I know just enough to be dangerous, and I'll give the wrong answer. But there is and I should know as a footnote to the Dow's water saga is that after that 29% figure was revealed, the company and the city came to an agreement, so the city would get repaid, not in water, but in that the residents would not have their water bills increased. That's the other thing that is a challenge, and we've seen this too with cryptocurrency mining, which is another very data-hungry, high-tech activity that's happening in rural areas with excess power, is that actually when it happens at such intensity that it takes power away from the users of that local utility, and it drives up electrical rates. So people are paying more in upstate New York or eastern Washington or something because there's a crypto mine buzzing away or a data center buzzing away. So keeping that, it is, again, not an infinite resource, and that's the pace at which these are growing. Now, I should note, I think the clean energy, this is so interesting. One interesting corollary of this energy consumption is that you combine this, growth in energy consumption with the reliance on fuels, sources like hydropower, kind of cleaner, non-coal and coal and gas. I'm curious to see kind of to what degree this might move energy markets more generally, if this is indeed growing so fiercely. Because you do have a kind of a power to move the needle and create demand for other types of energy or more energy infrastructure. It remains to be seen, but I think it's very, very interesting and perhaps a intriguing, side effect of all of this is will this reshape broader energy markets? A lot of other things will be inputs too. This isn't everything, but it's a lot greener than most. Oh, other industries developing on the Columbia besides data centers. Well, tourism is a big one. The hopes, the earlier 20th century hopes for making inland Oregon and Washington the West Coast capital of steel production and aluminum production. It was going to be the Pittsburgh of the West. That was part of the idea. That didn't come to pass. Yay, I guess. But there is, agriculture. This is still, and we have, when we think about the major industries of the state and the state of Oregon, that continues to be a significant one. So there, and all told, yes, there is a lot of energy and water consumption, but they are cleaner than other manufacturers. There is a kind of mythos that if it's coming from if it's Google or Microsoft, it has to be clean. And that's been something that's been a sort of a long-standing trope about high-tech industry. It's cleaner. That was the way that semiconductor fab plants were sold to parts of the United States. Turns out fabricating semiconductors is not clean at all. There are many Superfund sites that are former chip-making plants. So there, just because there isn't a belching smokestack doesn't mean it's as clean. But I think it's a real challenge. It's a sort of challenge of rural America. And we see this, this is why these rural localities across the country are giving tax breaks and welcoming these data centers and these facilities, because these are rural economies that, you've got prisons, you've got military bases, agriculture. We have such an geographically, economically uneven geography in the United States right now. So that's part of it.
Talk about why there's not been any talk about putting environmental guardrails on the increasing use and dependence on the power of AI and cloud storage, now when the demand for power and water resulting from the climate crisis is engulfing us.
Well, I think part of this is because it's just such a fast-moving phenomenon, that the growth of AI generally and the investments is just happening at such a rapid pace. But this is very much a state and local story of state and local policies that have been, encouraged certain types of economic development and discouraged others, and those can be very powerful levers. And tax policy can be very powerful too. I think there's, again, the state of Oregon wasn't thinking about data centers when the enterprise zone program was created in the 1980s. But there is an argument that, on the floor of the Oregon legislature, there have been quite a few debates over why are we giving companies like Amazon and Meta and Apple all of these tax breaks? Maybe they don't need the money. So, I think particularly for people in the Pacific Northwest who are kind of thinking about how do you create a more, even if you think, okay, this is a good thing and a necessary thing, and, we do like our Gmail, and we are using this, all of this data center demand is driven in good part by the applications we use, as well as the enthusiasm for new large language models like ChatGPT and Claude and Gemini, et cetera. So, where can, being really thoughtful about, what is happening at the state legislative level and the state level and the local level that could be, create a more robust economic ecosystem that's better at creating permanent jobs, or that is taking some of these environmental costs into account, and, rather than thinking, oh, this is something beyond my control, because this is something in the realm of things that are that there are a lot of things that are beyond our control. This is something where there's an interesting, very, very hyper-local dimension to it that is, I think it's worth, the more, and it's just been moving so fast. I think the conversation around energy use and alternative energy is something that has been evolving very, very rapidly. And even a year or so ago, when I really started diving into this stuff in earnest, kind of gathering the research together, there's already just so much now that's been produced and so much more public conversation about this and reporting on this, in addition to academic papers that are looking at that energy use.
How do recent actions of the federal government affect the future of big data and AI, and maybe I'd add, all of us? No.
Oh, we weren't going to talk about politics.
Okay.
But everything is
big data and AI.
No, but I think this is the question of how will AI be regulated, or if it will be regulated, or who will regulate it, is a very salient question. And I think that this is all happening in the backdrop of a geopolitical competition over these technologies. So that is a rationale for this big spend. And one of the Trump administration has announced this $100 billion AI infrastructure partnership with SoftBank, OpenAI, called Stargate. Of course, it has a sci-fi name because, tech. And it, there is a real, where things are going right now is this feeling like we need to support the American companies in development of AI infrastructure and technologies as much as we can, because this is a global race. It isn't just an American one. And an American-built AI, like large language model or advanced AI that is built in America, that is informed by, American principles of, rule of law, is, we're kind of in a weird moment at the moment. But, I think that is giving additional fuel and policy fuel. And certainly during the Biden administration, part of what we also are, another part of this whole story is the staggering investments made in science and technology and infrastructure and green infrastructure during the Biden administration. And they are, that spigot of money is already flowing, including to states blue and red. And so they are, even though amid spending cuts or policy changes or regulatory changes, there is money that is coming out to invest in these types of things from the federal level that also has power to shape and incentivize certain types of economic development that is worth watching and paying attention to. And it's about tech broadly defined as well. It's about high-tech industries of all kinds, not just ones that make software and make the kind of products we make here in Seattle.
So thank you so much, Professor O'Mara. This was a wonderful, crowning, final lecture for this series.
Thanks, Jim. Appreciate it.